Isn't she elegant? It is great to be here as the, am I the chair of the Burch Committee?
Yes. You're the chair.
And also to be here to invite someone that we go way back together, right? Dr. Melvin Joyce. I'm going to read the formal introduction that's in the program, and then I'll just talk informally about how we met. Oh, before we do that, we want to acknowledge members of the Burch Committee who are here. Can you raise your hand? One person, let's give it up for the sister right here. We want to acknowledge distinguished faculty members, Dr. Shannon. We also want to acknowledge Sally McCoy, who's here. And the Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences, Dean Gary. Community members such as Juliet of the Spirits, who's always involved in our programming. And Dr. Kitty Ellison, who's in the back. And can we get a showing of hands of the members of the Department of English? All right. And especially for our great students here at Howard University, let's give a round of applause for the students. We're going to be joined shortly with Dr. Carr, Chair of the Africana Studies Department, who's going to bring the students over, which means it's going to be like 90 people. So let us begin. Dr. Melba Joyce Boyd is Distinguished Professor and Chair of Africana Studies at Wayne State University. She is the author of 13 books, including Wrestling with the Muse, Dudley Randall, and the Broadside Press, which received the 2005 Black Caucus of the American Library Association Book Honor for Nonfiction, and the editor of Roses and Revolutions, the collected writings of Dudley Randall, which received the 2010 Library of Michigan Notable Books Award, and was a finalist for a 2010 NAACP Image Award in Literature. Her 1994 book, Discarded Legacy, Politics and Poetics in the Life of Francis E.W. Harper, 1825 to 1911, was widely reviewed and praised by critics. 8 of her books are collections of poetry, the most recent of which are Death Dance of a Butterfly, Blues Music Sky of Morning, the German poems, and The Province of Literary Cats. She has won a number of awards for her poetry, including a Michigan Council for the Arts Individual Artist Award, and in 2009, she was a nominee for the Krieg Eminent Artist Award. In 1997, she was commissioned to write the official poem for the Charles H. Wright Museum of African American History, which was inscribed in bronze in the museum wall, and lines from her poem, We Want Our City Back, appear in the sculpture, transcending Michigan's tribute to labor in downtown Detroit. It was cool because when it first opened, Melba brought me there and showed me the poem and stuff. Her poetry has been translated into German, Italian, and Spanish, and has appeared in numerous anthologies and international journals. She is also the co-editor with M.L. Liebler of Abandoned Automobile, Detroit City Poetry, 2001. Dr. Boyd lectures at universities and conferences throughout the United States and abroad, and is the author of over 50 published essays on African American literature and film. She is also the writer, producer, and director of the documentary film The Black Unicorn, Dudley Randall and the Broadside Press. She is the series co-editor of the African American Life series at Wayne State University Press, and a contributing editor for The Black Scholar, the Journal of Black Studies and Research. Dr. Boyd has been a Fulbright professor at the University of Bremen in Germany, and in 2009, she was a visiting professor at Fudan University in Shanghai, China. She has held professorial positions at the University of Iowa, Ohio State University, and the University of Michigan, where she continues to be an adjunct professor for the Center for Afro-American African Studies. She received a Doctor of Arts in English at the University of Michigan in 1979, and a BA in 1971, and an MA in 1972 in English at Western Michigan University. Let's give it up. Clearly, she is a Renaissance woman. I met Melba back in 1992 in Paris, France. It was the Richard Wright Conference, and me and a friend of mine, two friends of mine, poet friends, Lamont Steptoe and Kevin Powell, took ourselves from New York City and Philly to Paris to crash this conference. I basically took my Pell money. So let's get up for Howard Dotson right here, everybody. I took my Pell money and said, forget about paying bills and stuff, I'm going to Paris. And so Kevin Powell, we got kicked out of our hotel room and we didn't have any money to get another room. And my first book was published at the time called Emergency. And I said, well, let's just sell my books or whatever. So we ran into, it was at the Sorbonne in Paris, so we ran into these kids. And they said, we'll help you sell the books and stuff. And the children ended up being Melba's two children and her nephew, Stanley. And they took my little book and they ran around and they got Danny Glover to buy a copy and other distinguished people to buy it. And they just loved me and Kevin because we were like the youngest people in that whole thing. And we cracked jokes and they loved it. And so Melba just took us in. And after that Paris gig, I think 1993, she brought us to University of Michigan in Flint to read poetry. And I remember her little nephew Stanley was a little tight, a little chunky kid. And I would read my poems and they would have curse words and stuff like that. He'd be rolling around laughing hysterically in the aisles and stuff, cracking up. But ever since those times, she's been, a great support of my work, and she's brought me to Detroit so many times. The last time was last week, where we celebrated Dudley Randall and Robert Hayden's centennial. And prior to that, it was a great moment because she had me read with Lorenzo Thomas, who was such a fantastic poet and literary critic. And that was about 4 years before he passed, right? So I'll never forget that. So please welcome my close friend, Dr. Melba Joyce Ford.
Here. I also want to recognize Nubia Kai, Detroiter, fine writer, poet, and we go way, way, way back.
Yeah.
Candace Shannon, who was, oh my God, we go way back. Michigan State, partying, yeah. She's from Detroit, and we lost her to some years ago, but it's just a pleasure to be here. I'm really honored. There are all these connections that are made, and this is the first time that I've actually spoken at Howard, which is kind of strange. I've spoken like everywhere, but not here, and. But you black people come through here, you know what I'm saying? My youngest sister went to grad school here, so I've been on the campus for writers' conferences back in the 70s, so a lot of fond memories. And as an African American Studies scholar, certainly this is a magical and wonderful place, and I'm so appreciative of being asked to speak to you today. And Professor Traylor, good seeing you. We see her all the time at conferences. I don't go to so many conferences anymore. Me? Yeah. But when you don't have tenure yet, you have to go to those things. appeal to them, you know, be in your profession. But at any rate, today I want to talk about Detroit's literary heritage. And it's a very unique but connected one, and in the sense that we're talking about two writers who were also editors and scholars. I'm thinking also at this moment of Sterling Brown, and who was a great professor and studied his work. And also it was Dudley Randall who brought Sterling Brown's work back into print and Broadside Press. And one of the stories that won't be, I haven't thought about it, but it's so important to this moment, was when Dudley Randall was named the Poet Laureate of the City of Detroit by Mayor Coleman Alexander Young. Sterling Brown was in Detroit for that occasion, and Mayor Young talked about during the early days of the labor movement in Detroit how they used to recite in memory during demonstrations, what have you, the poem Strong Men by Sterling Brown. So I think this is extremely important for students to understand that the connection between literature and history is very significant in the struggle of African Americans in this country and elsewhere. And that persons that you don't think of necessarily being, quote unquote, formally educated were extremely well read, like Coleman Young, for example. When he passed away, his library, so extensive, and I actually managed to bid and get a copy of Dudley Randall's A Litany of Friends that he had signed to Coleman Young, and I got that book and took it to Dudley and had him sign it to my son, because my son said, I want to have a book signed by Mr. Randall, and he kept saying, no, he's not going to be here forever. So I had Dudley sign that copy to my son, and he told me, you better keep it at home though, because you know how to move around. So he didn't want to lose it. But again, I'm really happy to be here, and hopefully we'll be able to shed some light on the importance of the lives of Dudley Randall and Robert Hayden. I'm going to begin now by reading a couple of short pieces that I wrote. One about Dudley, which is the epilogue at the end of the biography, Wrestling with the Muse, Dudley Randall, the Broadside Press. I'm sitting in a plaza on the perimeter of a medieval castle, the Castilla di San Michele, on the island of Sardinia, once a Roman outpost in the Mediterranean Sea. The buildings in the distance are pink and yellow and terracotta. The sea and the hills and the clouds meet each other in wavering shades of blue. It is partially sunny, and because of this, it is sometimes cool, sometimes hot. I've just left an international conference dedicated to the study of African American culture. Everyone there knows who Dudley Randall was, and they queried me about the status of the manuscript. Yesterday, at lunch, I met a scholar from Russia. He reminded me of Robert Hayden, his facial contours, the coat-bottle thick lens of his glasses, his often tentative mannerisms. I told him about this resemblance, and he was complimented. He smiled and told me he had quoted from Hayden's poem, The Middle Passage, in his presentation on the film Amistad. We talked about Hayden until a younger American scholar, whose research focused on the Moors, asked about Pushkin, and the conversation returned to Dudley Randall, whose translations and interest in Russian poetry enlivened our conversation. I promised to send the Russian scholar my documentary film on Dudley. In this ancient space where armies clashed and merchants exchanged goods and stories with sailors, I can see the crossing roots of humanity in the bronze complexions and black curly hair of the people. As I walk through the narrow, crooked streets, the cracks in the concrete castle events the ages, and a casual indifference for counting time in the face of a droit de vivre. The youth hold very little awe for this history. Graffiti appears in bold letters on the walls and entrances of the castle, and the heavy bass and contemporary poetry of American rap reverberates from their music boxes, leaving impressions like shadows darkening stone. At this moment, I'm thinking about how Dudley once explained the value of anonymity for poets to a New York Times reporter. Standing in the cold of winter, he said, "Not many places where I go do they know I'm a poet. Forget about their knowing I'm poet laureate. But I'm always aware of the title," he said as he punched at an imaginary target. "But I believe a poet can change things. He can change the way people look and feel about things. And that's what I want to do in Detroit." Moments later, he's behind the wheel of his battered blue Dodge, driving downtown along a deserted Woodward Avenue in nighttime Detroit. He tells his passenger, "Look out your window, and what do you see? I bet you see nothing more than a dirty, dingy, empty street. But I look out the window and I see memories. I hear things. I see myself as a boy walking down that block, coming home from my job at the foundry. I remember how I felt when I came back from the war. I can remember the race riots in 1943, moving up this block, people turning over streetcars. I can hear my daddy calling me." When I went to graduate school at the University of Michigan, 1976, one of the main reasons I went to U of M, other than the fact that I got a scholarship, was because Robert Hayden was on the English faculty there. And of course, Dudley really encouraged us. Like I said, for those who don't know, I was Dudley Randall's assistant editor at Broadside Press from 1972 to 1977, pretty much when I went back to, when I returned to the academy. And so I was very excited about the possibility of studying with Robert Hayden. Dudley Randall on one hand, Robert Hayden on the other. You can't go wrong with that, right? But he was in D.C. at the Library of Congress. He was the poet laureate at that time, was a poetry consultant. And he was actually the first African American to be honored with that position. So, his good fortune was my bad luck. But at any rate, he returned to campus in 1978, and I was teaching composition and writing my dissertation. And I'm going to read it's a short piece out of an essay, a collection of essays on Robert Hayden. And it's sort of the beginning, and I think you might appreciate this moment. I met Robert Hayden one October day in 1978 as I got onto the elevator in Haven Hall, the University of Michigan. He had just returned to campus after a 2-year appointment as poetry consultant at the Library of Congress, and I, a doctoral candidate in the English department, had hoped to study creative writing with him. But his residence in Washington, D.C. coincided with my graduate tenure in Ann Arbor. A few days before this chance meeting on the elevator, I had attended his poetry reading at the Detroit Public Library for the dedication of the Jacob Lawrence exhibition of the legend of John Brown, containing 22 screen prints. Hayden was commissioned to write a poem for the occasion and the publication about the John Brown series. It was one of the most memorable poetry readings I have ever experienced. The audience was mesmerized by his imagery, hypnotized by words that pierced our fragile fears and that empowered our bewildered humanity. It was as if Hayden had evoked the spirit of John Brown into the auditorium. As he read John Brown, we gave witness and wept for this sacrificial figure. But the same man whose words had engulfed an auditorium and left hundreds breathless, fluttered like a delicate hummingbird in the small quarters of the elevator. startled by my surprise and excitement upon seeing him. The seeming contrast of power and shyness was a reflection of a unique sense of being. Like the tension between poetry and audience, Hayden was oblivious to posture and pretension and understood the terrible beauty that lives in the song and the saying. It was really, and it was really funny because you know, it's more lyrical here, but actually what happened was elevator doors opened and Robert Hayden was standing there and I yelled, Robert Hayden! And I scared the poor man to death, you know, he was looking like trying to go out the back of the elevator and I really felt, you know, really bad, you know, that I carried on. I was like, I was treating him like he was a rock star. But also what was interesting to me was here, he was so important to me. He was one of the first black poets that I read when I was in high school. He was a Detroiter, and so one of my neighbors, my mother was a physical education teacher, and my father was an engineer. So we had like, you know, black history books, and we were like, you know, race pie and all that stuff. We had all that in Carter G. Woodson, but literature was not in the library. But my neighbor, who was an elementary school teacher, she had a collection of poetry and literature, and that's when I first read Robert Hayden and Dudley Randall, and became aware that literature was being written in Detroit, about Detroit, you know, by Detroiters, which was extremely empowering for a young person who was studying English in the remote place like Kalamazoo, Michigan, and always being the only black person in the classroom. And so it was that all of that going all the way back to, you know, being 17 years old and seeing someone who you had admired from afar. But I mean, I settled him down and it was cool, you know, actually I could have been too intimidating. After all, I was also pregnant with my son, so, you know, he realized I wasn't a threat and he sort of settled down. And he was very nice and accommodating. What we've been doing in Detroit for the last year is having various events and activities in the metropolitan area, and including, you know, Ann Arbor and at different venues at the Wright Museum of African American History, Mary Grove College, at University of Detroit. And University of Detroit is where Dudley Randall served as the reference librarian for many years. And upon his death on August 5th, 2000, the Friends of the Library of Congress deemed his workplace a national literary monument, landmark, I'm sorry. And if you go to the library, there's actually this official plaque from the Library of Congress. Now this is extremely important. I don't think there's any more than maybe 50 or 60 of these, and it may have been the first one given to a black writer. And also, the point too about Dudley Randall is he was a librarian. And so librarians, you know, held him in really high esteem, and it had a lot to do with his success as a publisher, because he not only wrote literature, he understood books. And I'll talk about that a little bit more later on. But this is it's extremely important moment. So we had a reading on his birthday at the University of Detroit, and his poetry and so forth. Now the first event we had was in a place that's been renamed Paradise Valley Park. And I'm going to be talking about the early years of Dudley Randall and Robert Hayden, because Paradise Valley was a community, a neighborhood that used to exist in Detroit. And it was right next to another community which was called Black Bottom. And you can abstracting there what Black Bottom was, right? It's where Black people lived. During the early part of the 20th century in particular. And the interesting thing about that name, of course, is once you go into the imagery, it was named Black Bottom before Black people moved there, because it was an area near the Detroit River, and during the 19th century, the land was very rich because of this, and there was actually farming that took place in that area. And then Black people, when they migrated to Detroit, first during part of the Underground Railroad, and then subsequently during the Great Migrations, they were not allowed to live in different parts of the city. There were actual, what they call restrictive covenants that would not allow Black people to live, and Black people, brown people, yellow people, or Jews in certain neighborhoods in the city of Detroit. So they primarily lived in either Black Bottom, Paradise Valley, or where they lived in a certain area on the west side of the city until you got to go to court, you got to fight these things, and eventually it changes. Now the whole city's Black. But Dolly Grounder and Robert Hayden grew up in this community. And Paradise Valley was a place where it was largely like where the nightclubs and the entertainment. A very famous hotel was there, the Eaton Hotel. And this is where Duke Ellington and Billie Holiday and all of the entertainers would come. And so it was a very rich place. And the poetry, the early poetry, especially by Dudley Randall and Robert Hayden, is grounded in those early beginnings. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to start with some images. Frank Rashid and I did a presentation at Marygrove College, which is another college in Detroit. And Frank is a Hayden scholar. And so we did sort of a duo thing, and he also manages a site called the Detroit Literary Map. And so he has all these wonderful images. And so I'm going to share those with you today and try to give you an understanding, especially many of you young people in the room, of what Detroit was like at the beginning of the 20th century, and where a lot of the problems, struggles, and images might come from. Where is this?
Justin.
So this is pre-Depression Detroit, and some basic statistics in terms of the population of Detroit and how swiftly it grew. As you can tell, when we get into the 20th century, this is largely the consequence of the explosion of the automobile industry and the migration of people to the area. In 1930, we had 1.5 million people living in Detroit. These are some of the major architectural wonders, and all this is happening at the beginning. Ford Building, 1909. David Whitman Building, downtown. Blue Cadillac Hotel. The Knapsack Building, that was, I think, the tallest building. It still be the tallest building in Detroit, I'm not completely sure. Sort of Detroit's Guardian Building. If you ever come to Detroit, if you don't see any other building, go see the Guardian. There's absolutely amazing architectural, just beautiful building on the outside and on the inside. This is General Motors building that used to be, well, it's still there, but General Motors is not there. They moved it into the offices now. Albert Kahn was a very prominent architecture. In fact, my office building at Wayne State, which I don't have here, is our Albert Kahn building. Absolutely gorgeous building. One of the reasons I wanted to Wayne State, I can't find a place to grow up anywhere. But it was a very prosperous time for Detroit. These buildings are very, very lush. I mean, marble, inlaid gold. I mean, just absolutely, a lot of wealth. Now, Paradise Valley. This is a quote from Thomas Segru. Detroit's post-war urban crisis emerged as a consequence of two of the most important interrelated and unresolved problems in American history: that capitalism generates economic inequality and that African Americans have disproportionately borne the impact of that inequality. This is an earlier shot of the city of Detroit. That's the Detroit River. A lot of people think Detroit is on a Great Lake. It is not. It's on the Detroit River, just below Lake Huron, and that's why our weather isn't quite as bad as Chicago's. And that's also another reason for that. It was actually a city where Native Americans, Great Lake Indians, traded there. So when the French got to Detroit, there was already a city there. So they just changed the name. Just want you to know. Detroit is a very large, in terms of area, it's 139 square miles. A lot of space. Detroit is also a city of houses. People in houses, they live in tenement buildings or in apartment buildings, very few. They have some downtown, but primarily Detroit has built homes and had large communities. Now this is a shot from would be Black Bottom. You see here, these are the port officials. They used to do things, port motor companies have a thing called sociology department. And they would go around and this is, like UAW, and they would decide who deserved a raise and who didn't deserve a raise based on how they lived or, yeah, seriously, I don't make this. Can't make anything that crazy up, right? You can see the black people and these are, the white people. And one of the things too was, I think it comes out in it's just a matter of Middlesex, about how in Detroit the services they would pick up in white neighborhoods would not always collect the garbage in black neighborhoods, which is very interesting because the stereotype that's perpetuated about black people being, unclean, unhealthy, well, a lot of it had to do with reasons that were obviously beyond our control. So another quote from Segru. Paradise Valley, a mixture of everything imaginable, including overcrowding, delinquency, and disease. It has glamour, action, religion, pathos. It has brains and organization and business. This is a quote from Gloucester Current, who was the president of Detroit branch of NAACP in 1940. The Detroit branch of NAACP, I don't know if it is now, but it used to be the largest branch in the country. So Robert Hayden was born on August the 4th in 1913 in Detroit. And he died in 1980 in Ann Arbor, Michigan, where he had been professor for some years. Billy Randall was born in 1914 right here in Washington, D.C., and his parents lived in St. Louis, and then they eventually immigrated to Detroit when Dudley was 6 years old, and so he spent most of his life in Detroit, except for the times that he worked as a librarian at Lincoln University in Missouri, and then at Morgan State in the 1950s. But he was only away from Detroit about 1951. By the time he graduated from the University of Michigan with his master's degree in library science, until 1956, he returned to Detroit when he was able to get a job with the Wayne County Federated Library System, and then subsequently he worked as librarian at the University of Detroit. It's Robert Hayden, Dudley Randall. You can see Hayden's glasses. Michigan Chronicle, which was the main black newspapers that came out of Detroit. He also, and he wrote, I think this is the, I don't know if this is the one, but he would review plays and cultural events. And also he reviewed Gone with the Wind. And as you can imagine, he was highly critical of Gone with the Wind, which was this big, huge, won like 11 Academy Awards and have all these outrageous images of black people. And then Robert Hayden also was working for the WPA during the Depression. And during that time, he worked both with the labor union, but he also wrote a history of blacks in Michigan. That's a work that now they're trying to, the executive of his estate is trying to get that in print. Very, very important. You can only see it in the Library of the University of Michigan Special Collections. CKLW, Hayden also had a radio program, I worked on a radio program. CKLW is a radio station, I guess it's still operating, Candy, you might know better than me, but it's in Windsor, Canada. And it's very important at this point that I know that since Detroit is literally just like a mile and a half from Canada, I mean, it's you cross the bridge or take the tunnel and you're in Ontario. Other than the important significance of that relative to the Underground Railroad, also it has to do with opportunities. So when you think about he could work on a radio station in the 1930s in Canada, but not in the United States. But that's how close, freedom can be, and also it has a tremendous impact on the way that you view yourself, which is beyond the borders of the United States, because you're right on the border, right? And so that was an awesome opportunity, and he would actually report on culture and things that were happening with black people in Detroit and in the United States on this program. That's the young Robert Hayden. The poems that were written during this time. This is from Heart Shaping the Dust. This is a very interesting history behind this book. These images largely came from black people living in Black Bottom or Paradise Valley. And very much, when you think about people like Sterling Brown, for example, Hayden and Randall were very close to the sound and the language, of, as Hayden would say, the folk, the people, and also to music. Very use of blues and jazz is part of the undercurrent of the way that the aesthetic is developing at this time. This is also from Heart Shape. Another interesting thing about this book was that since Hayden had very poor eyesight, he said to Dudley he wanted to have his poems typed up so he could enter into a contest. And he said, I just don't want to go through the trouble. And so Dudley said, well, I'll type them up for you. And he did win the contest, but what happens is that this becomes Hayden's first book, and it is financed through a group of men who were involved in the labor movement at that time. And then they, the Michigan Chronicle, which had a printing press, they actually provided the printing for the book. And so this is, I think, a characteristic of Detroiters and the idea of being from a city where you make things and not waiting for someone to say you can have a book. And so this is a very, very important moment, not only for Hayden, but I think, and I write about this, it's an indication of who Dudley Randall is going to become as an editor. That the idea of doing a book was not something that was beyond the imagination, or we can't do that. And so this book is very important on a number of levels. This poem by Randall, Laughter in the Slums. Again, the imagery
recalls Southern origins, and also, you know, the sort of hot little furnace son of Georgia Zooms. You get that mixture of also the working in the foundry and so forth in the city of Northern Winter. Ghetto Girls. This was a poem that was originally titled Hastings Street Girls. Hastings Street was the main street that ran through Black Bottom and into Paradise Valley. And I think in the clip that you're going to see, he's going to talk about Hastings Street because Joe Lewis, who you've probably all heard of, the prize fighter, he was from Detroit. Most of the time when you see movies and stuff and references, they don't mention Detroit. He just shows up in New York at the party. Nobody talks about Detroit, you know, it's just unbelievable. Like Malcolm X, now I teach the Malcolm X film. Malcolm X spent a lot of time in Detroit, and then when you, next time you watch the film by Spike Lee, when he says my name is Red, no, his name was Detroit Red.
That's right.
So I just think it's interesting how culture manages to edit Detroit out of, you know, sort of major presentations. I don't understand. I got to figure that out at some point. That'll be my next book. But this poem was initially accepted for publication by Opportunity, which was a journal that published literature in the 1930s, but it folded, and so they returned the poem to Randall, and it was not published until, you have the dates in there, 1937, 1967. That poem is not published until 40 years later. And so since Hastings Street was gone, it had been bulldozed because highway, you know, I-75, you know, the highway that will take you to Atlanta, well, it goes to Detroit and all the way up to Mackinac, I think is where it ends. Well, that came right through Black Bottom and totally destroyed the neighborhood. So he changed the title to Ghetto Girls. Those Winter Sundays, I'm not going to talk much about this because we're going to actually see him reading it, and Darwin Turner will comment on this. This is the Ford Foundry, which was, I guess at one time, the largest foundry anywhere, certainly in North America. Dudley Randall worked at the Rouge Foundry when he was a young man, and one of his most famous poems, George, is a reflection on that experience. It's also during the 1930s. Dudley is a member of the UAW, but the UAW is not recognized by Ford Motor Company or anything at this time. So they were basically regarded as troublemakers. And there's some interesting aspects, and in the film you'll see what I try to do with the imagery is to merge the images from the factory, contemporary, and in the past, and also from the labor movement, which actually resulted in some people being killed because they were striking for better wages for workers. Here you see black workers. This is probably from the Walter Reuther collection at Wayne State University, the labor archives. Walter Reuther took a number of photos, he and his brother, of workers during the 1930s, and this is a good representation. This is the poem George, which you will hear shortly. Paris Picnic, Mendelssohn during the Depression. It's another poem from that period, Great Depression, 1930s. Summertime in the Living. There's a lot of similarity between the poetry of Dudley Randall and Robert Hayden during this period. For obvious reasons, similar setting, similar circumstances. There are some differences between the two writers in terms of their backgrounds. Dudley Randall came from a family, both his parents were college educated. His mother was actually teaching at Hampton when she met Dudley's father, and they married, and then his father went to Talladega College in Alabama, and they were from Macon. He and his brother literally walked from Macon, Georgia to Talladega. So whenever, literally walked. Okay, so so this is at the turn of the 19th century. So whenever your students start feeling like you're having a hard time, just think about the fact that you have to walk all the way to Washington, D.C. to go to college. So the Randall family was very gifted and historically, going back to the end of the Civil War, very much invested and believed in education, in race pride, independence. His grandfather actually ran a cab service, and his grandmother was one of the founders of the church in Macon, the black church, because they were tired of sitting in the balcony of the white church, and so he came from family that would do things, and a lot of the quote Negro first that you hear of. His uncle actually went to law school here at Howard University and was one of the first blacks to practice law, in Georgia. His sister worked for the UAW, was the secretary for the UAW, and his older brother was the first, one of the first black professors at the University of Michigan. They did not view discrimination as the final word. And so I think when I started doing the research on Dudley's family history, I said, well, no wonder he didn't think it was a big deal to start a publishing company. That's what the Randalls did. You want to make books, you make books, So it's just an amazing family, and also it's an amazing sort of comment, I think, on our history in a much larger context. That people think that things just happened recently, but we stand on the shoulders of giants.
That's right.
Who lifted us in ways that we can't necessarily see, but it didn't just happen. Another famous poem by Robert Hayden. This is Tiger Flowers. He was a famous boxer who was from Detroit. I think someone mentioned it earlier how much they like the poem by Hayden. This is a reference to the painting by Rousseau that appears in the poem about Tiger Flowers. Very, very, very complex. Elegies of Paradise Valley, you'll hear parts of this poem. It's a very long poem, so you only hear parts of this part here. Will be read by Hayden. So I think I'm going to stop here. We need to pop in the videos so you can actually hear the writers. And Randall, this is taken from an excerpt from my documentary on Black Unicorn. And it's a more finished product. We premiered this film at the Detroit Institute of Arts on Dudley's birthday in 1996. So he actually got a chance to see it. And, yeah, ready? Okay.
It's a juicy stuff.
You gotta turn the lights on.
Yeah, let's turn off the lights.
Try not to fondle each other in the dark.
A little louder there, Justin. Too light.
Mother dear, may I go downtown instead of off to play and march the streets of Birmingham in a freedom march today? No, baby, no. You may not go, for the dogs are fierce and wild, and clubs and hoses, guns and jails ain't good for a little child. But mother, I won't be alone. Other children will go with me and march the streets of Birmingham to make our country free. No, baby, no, you may not go, for I fear those guns will fire. But you may go to church instead and sing in the children's choir. She has combed and brushed her night dark hair and bathed rose petals sweet, and drawing white gloves on her small brown hands, and white shoes on her feet. The mother smiled to know her child was in the sacred place, but that smile was the last smile to come upon her face. For when she heard the explosion, her eyes grew wet and wild. She raced through the streets of Birmingham, calling for her child. She clawed through bits of glass and brick, then lifted out the shoe. Oh, here's the shoe my baby wore. But baby, where are you?
Please help me welcome the Honorable Mayor Coleman A. Young.
Thank you. Well, I'm here with the rest of you to celebrate the 25th anniversary of Broadside Press, and in person to greet the poet laureate of the city of Detroit. Well, this is your 10th anniversary. It was in 1980. I remember too. That I first declared you Detroit's first and only poet laureate. And you were that today. Long before you were poet laureate, you served the city. And since you've become it, you've continued to serve the city. We are honored by your massive efforts to preserve and publish black artists. And when they could not be preserved or published in any other place, your contribution to the consciousness of Broadside Press are well known. I want to thank the best for what they've done to carry on that tradition. Detroit is a unique place. Its people make it unique. It's people like Dudley Randall and the best which make it unique.
I came to Detroit on New Year's Day, 1920. I remember the date because when the train pulled into the station and we got off, you could hear the bells ringing, whistles blowing. It was New Year's. I remember standing by the big locomotive. The wheels were just about as tall as I was. And that was in January 1st. And my birthday was January 14th. So I arrived here when I was almost 6. My father was a minister, that was his vocation, but he didn't always work as a minister. He came to Detroit from a job in Eastside Louisville as a YMCA secretary. I think he hoped to get a job with the Ford Motor Company because there were a lot of blacks coming up north to Detroit and getting jobs there in personnel, but he didn't get the job. So he worked first as a salesman. And being a preacher and able to talk, he was a pretty good salesman. He worked for Absecure Company. We lived there in Hastings Street. Later on, when we bought our house and moved to Maple and Russell, about 3 or 4 blocks below the Eastern Market. But mostly in my childhood, I remember being a Boy Scout. That was a big thing in my life. I had 2 older brothers. They were Boy Scouts. And we'd go camp in the summer. We would drill in the streets. This troop was Troop 238. It was sponsored by Plymouth Congregational Church, the Church of Reverend Hood now. But at that time, it was a little church on Eaton Street near St. Albans. And there was Reverend Burch and Reverend Lavis Collins. Then after Reverend Lavis Collins, there was Horace White, the famous labor union supporter and preacher. And he was succeeded by Reverend Hood. We'd go to camp every summer in Vandalia, Michigan. That's in southwestern Michigan, where there were many black farmers, runaway slaves settled in southwestern Michigan near Cassopolis. And there were Quakers living there. There was an underground railroad station in that area. And that's where you'll find black farmers in southwestern Michigan. And they lived there since before the Civil War. I was reading poetry from an early age because we had it at home. My mother was a school teacher, my father was a preacher, and the house was always full of books. I remember the books that we had. I can remember them not only for the contents, but for the surface, the color and feel of the books. My father had a 2-volume edition of Browning's lyrics in white covers, trimmed with gold, and he had a cowhide bound volume of Tennyson's complete poems. And my mother resented that book because it was given to him by his girlfriend when he was in college. But those were books, I like the feel of the books, the heft of the books. My mother had a book called Favorite Poems, and a lot of the poems in that book were my favorites, because a child doesn't have a good taste in poetry. Just as children would go to the movies now and like horror pictures, I would like poems in that book, favorite poems like Longfellow's The Skeleton in Armor, and Ed Brown Poe's The Raven, and The Wreck of the Hesperus, and Biggin on the Rhine, There's a German Soldier Dying. It's all very sentimental and scary and not very good poetry, but that's what a kid likes. You develop your taste, you go up from Ed Brown Poe and Longfellow to better poets. At Duffield, Miss Poindexter called me reading Macbeth in class. And that was something I wasn't supposed to do. And I just liked poetry. And then when we moved to a house on Russell, I guess I was about 9 years old when I started writing poetry to influence a girl who lived upstairs. Amen. And it was still, while we lived in that house on Russell, that was where I really grew up. Became 21 in that house. We were buying it. And we lost it during the Depression. It was a very big house, 11 rooms. And I would sit on the roof of the porch underneath the shade of a tree of heaven, and read poetry, Keats and Shelley. It was while I was living in that house that I finally decided to be a poet. I definitely made up my mind I'd be a poet. I was 13 years old. I was attending Eastern High School at that time, and I earned my first money by sending a poem to the Detroit Free Press. They had a young people section every Sunday, and there was a poets page. And there was one poem which would be the prize poem every week. You could win a prize of $1. And that's the way I earned my first money writing poetry. The first poem I sent to the page was a sonnet on one of these icy mornings when the trees are covered with ice and they glitter in the street lights. I wrote a sonnet, and it won the prize of $1, which was big back in 1930. I used to deliver papers, and at that time the Sunday papers came out on Saturday night, and I would pick up my papers where the truck would throw them on the corner, and I would go to St. Joe's Catholic school and sit down on one of the windows and reach in the Sunday paper to see whether my poem had been published. During the Harlem Renaissance, the crisis and opportunity were very good outlets outlets for black poets. But in 1937, I sent a poem, Hastings Street Girls, to Opportunity, and the editor accepted it. But then Opportunity ceased publishing, and the editor sent the poem back. And it was not until I put out a book in 1971 that that poem was published. That was about 40 years later. And the poems that were published in the 60s had been written maybe in the 40s. George. When I was a boy, desiring the title of man and toiling to earn it, in the inferno of the foundry knockout, I watched and admired you, working by my side, as goggled with mask on your mouth and shoulders bright with sweat, you mastered the monstrous, lumpish cylinder blocks. And when they clogged the line and plunged to the floor with force enough to tear your footing to, you calmly stepped aside. One day, when the line broke down and the blocks reared up, groaning, grinding, and mounted like an ocean wave, and then rushed thundering down like an avalanche, and we frantically dodged, then braced our heads together to form an arch to lift and stack them. You gave me your highest accolade. You said, you're not afraid of sweat. You're strong as a mule. And now, here, in the hospital, in a ward where old men wait to die, you sit and watch time go by. You cannot read the books I bring, not even those that are only picture books. As you sit among the senile wrecks, the psychopaths, the incontinent. One day, when you fell from your chair and stared at the air with a look of fright which sight of death inspires, I lifted you like a cylinder block and said, don't be afraid of a little fall, for you will be here a long time yet, because you're strong as a mule. In 1929, there came the big crash, and the Rube still didn't want to make them wrestle during the Depression. Everybody was out of work. But, really that was a happy time when you look back, because folks were more together then. There were no robberies because there was nothing to rob. You could leave your door unlocked. I don't remember locking our front door. And you could visit your neighbors, you sat on the porch, you knew everybody passing down the street. My brother got a job cleaning up a sermon radio company, and he was able to buy a radio. And it was sometime during the 30s we got our first radio. People would go to other people's houses and listen to the radio or to the ball game. And they listened to Joe Lewis's fights too. And he would say, Mom, I'm glad I'm there. Hello, Mom, I'm glad I'm there. And then after the fight, everybody would rush out the street, go up and down the rest of the street on Hastings and Adams. The cars would be parading through the streets, and people would make confetti out of broken clubs and throw confetti in the street. It was a big celebration. They had a little restaurant downtown, they called it the Penny Kitchen on Monroe. Or you could get a dish, say, for a penny, or 2 cents, or 3 cents. Maybe a meal would cost about 9 or 10 cents. But then there was that event of being black. My brother and I were out of town, and we wanted to get some food, so we went in this penny kitchen. And the proprietor said, we'll serve you, but you'll have to eat in the kitchen. And my brother said, this is the cheapest damn place in town. And you want us to eat in their kitchen? So we walked out, we didn't eat. It occurred, it started Sunday around Belle Isle and around the Naval Armory on Jefferson at the foot of the bridge to Belle Isle. Now, Monday morning, I didn't know anything about what happened Sunday. Monday morning, when I was delivering mail, I worked in a Polish neighborhood. A woman in a lunch stand told me there had been fighting. But I didn't know anything about it. It was peaceful on my route. But when I got back to the office and the mailman came in for lunch, they came in with tales of Hastings Street being littered with glass, people breaking windows and looting. The inspectors came to the station during lunchtime and the men were assigned to different routes. I was assigned to a route in a black neighborhood. And I think I went on Hastings. And I saw that Hastings was covered with glass. And I went into the store where the windows were broken out. I think it was a jewelry store. And when I went in with the mail, there were some cops inside and they raised their guns and said, "What do you want?" I said, "I want to get out." But no, I didn't really say that. That's what I did say. I said I was delivering the mail. So they took the mail and didn't buy it. And the mailman came in with different tales. At that time, the United States government was respected. One white man in a black neighborhood said people followed him, that he had given checks to and had taken care of their mail. They followed him around and said, "We're not going to let anybody buy you." Later on, I went to my regular route, which was in a Polish neighborhood. Nothing happened to me. I heard the kids on the porch. One kid said, "What is he doing in our neighborhood?" And another kid said, "Well, he's a mailman. He has just much right to be here as anybody else." So I took the streetcar home, and when we got on Oakland, people started storming the streetcar. The people pulled down the shades to protect themselves from the bricks and the rocks and the concrete. I got out of the car on the corner of Oakland and Holbrook, or Claremont. And I watched the people in the crowd. They would stone the motorists as they went by. If there were whites in the car, they would stone the car. And the blacks in the car would put a white handkerchief on their car. And I went home and everybody had a story to tell. There was a man who had just come to Detroit from the South. I was living with a young couple from Lincoln University in Missouri. And this was a friend of theirs from the South. But when he was coming to their house on the Woodland Avenue streetcar, they had stolen the streetcar, and they were dragging blacks out of the streetcars and beating them. And the instructor told him to hide in the seat so the mob wouldn't get him. So he got to our house safely. But he was so scared of the violence of the North that he said he was going right back down south where he could be safe. And there had been racial tension in Detroit. There was a lot of work in Detroit in the plants. And there was pressure to upgrade blacks. And there was resistance on the part of whites. In spite of the good work of the UAW. The UAW was a liberal union. But there were whites who resented blacks being hired and blacks being upgraded. There was also tension about housing. A few months before, there had been a riot at the Sojourner Truth Project when black tenants attempted to live there. My personal feeling was that, and this is the same day, a person is just a person. I look on people as individuals, and if they're good individuals, I like them. If they're bad individuals, I don't like them. I think it was the philosophy of my parents. We grew up reading books, we read books written by writers of every nation. We knew that there are good people in every country and good people of every race. And bad people of every race, and bad people in every nation. So we were always taught, not so much by precept, but by example. People were just people. I was a publisher, and I published my first book with Margaret Danner, poem, comic poem. And it's interesting about the format. Before it had been published, just before it had been published, I had been to the Soviet Union. And I saw copy little books about this high, or about 4 inches high, that sold for about 25 kopeck. That's about 25 cents. Cheaply priced. So I published that book in the first, in the same format, a tiny book with tiny print. I thought it would be very convenient for women to put it in their pocketbooks or for men to put it in their pockets. But it didn't sell well in that format. So I published it in the regular 8x5 format, and it sold better. I guess American people like buy books by the weight, by size, instead of by content. I was lucky to go to the Soviet Union after meeting with Margaret Burch. We went to an art camp outside of Moscow where they had painters from all the different regions of the Soviet Union. And we had seminars. We would talk about the way art is in Russia, or in the Soviet Union, the way art is supported in the United States. But at dinner, we had toasts after dinner. That's one of the most enjoyable parts, when you have the toast. They would drink, and everybody gets up and makes a toast. And some of the toasts were regular speeches. So everybody in our party would nudge somebody else and say, it's your turn, you're the leader of the delegation, you make the toast first. And Margaret Burch, she's a good speaker, she would always make the first toast. But then finally it got down to me, and we had talked about everything that you could think of, how nice the Russian people were, how we enjoyed being there, and solidarity and friendship and all that. So what I did was to read this famous poem of Pushkin, this love poem. Я вас любил, I loved you once. I loved you. And as soon as I started reading it, the people in the audience recognized it, and you could see their lips move. It's in a synchronization with mine as I read the poem. And they'd be saying it inaudibly with their lips while I was reading the poem. That's how well they know poetry, and how they enjoy it and love it.
Я вас любил. I loved you once. Love even yet, it may be. Within my soul has not quite died away. But let that cause you no anxiety. I will not give you pain in any way. I loved you silently and hopelessly, with jealousy, timidity brought low. I loved you so sincerely, tenderly, I pray to God some other love you so.
Russian poets are a great influence. I mean, they're powerful. And the powers, from the czars to the premiers, to the dictators, recognize that power. And that's why they've put them in jail, they put them in concentration camps, they've killed them, because they recognize that poets are powerful people. Poetry is power.
Music on the roses and revolutions, I saw night close down on the earth like a great dark wind. And the light of cities were like tapers in the night. And I heard the lamentations of 1,000,000 hearts, regretting life and crying for the grave. And I saw the Negro lying in the swamp with his face blown off, and in northern cities with his band aligned, and felt the writhing of his viscera like that of the hare hunted down, or the bear at bay. And I saw men working and taking no joy in their work, and embracing the hard I bore with joyless excitement, and lying with wives and virgins in impotent I groped in darkness and felt the pain of millions, gradually, like day driving night across the continent, I saw dawn upon them like the sun, a vision of a time when all men walked proudly through the earth, and the bombs and missiles lied at the bottom of the ocean, like the bones of dinosaurs buried under the shale of years. And men strive with each other, not for power or the accumulation of paper, but in joy create for others the house, the poem, the game of athletic beauty. Then washed in the brightness of this vision, I saw how in its radiance would grow and be nourished, and suddenly burst into terrible and splendid bloom, the blood-red flower of revolution.
The whole documentary is actually closer to an hour long, but this gives you a sense of really get to hear him and so forth, and also talking about history, giving that context. We're now going to have another piece. This is a work in progress, and they're just clips from Hayden reading his own poetry, and also comments from the late great literary critic Darwin T. Turner. Some of you may know who he is. If you don't, you'll be introduced to him. And I think this runs about 13 minutes, I think. Okay. So those winter Sundays, this is one of the poems. This beautiful poem. It's the most famous poem.
Sundays too, my father got up early and put his clothes on in the blue-black coat. Then with cracked hands ached from labor in the weekday weather, made campfires blaze. No one ever thanked him. I'd wake and hear the cold splintering, breaking. When the rooms were warm, he'd call, and slowly I would rise and dress, fearing the crying angers of that house, speaking indifferently to him who had driven out the cold and polished my good shoes as well. What did I know? What did I know of love's austere and lonely office?
Robert Hayden certainly must be ranked as one of the foremost creators of Afro-American literature. I've said that Hayden, unfortunately, was underappreciated during much of his career. During the 1940s, when there was an emphasis on protest literature of the kind represented by Richard Wright and Native Son, Hayden wrote protest, but that was not his particular artistic genius. In the 1950s, when black writers were emphasizing the humanness of the experience of black people, the humanness of black Americans themselves, trying to demonstrate how black Americans, in most important senses of virtue and hope, resembled the best of white Americans. During that period, Hayden was very much at home, but the American literary establishment tends to focus on only one or two black writers, and they were still giving attention to Richard Wright in fiction, to Langston Hughes in poetry, to Gwendolyn Brooks, who had won a Pulitzer, and finally at the end of the 50s, to Lorraine Hansberry, who became the first black to win a significant drama award. In that period then, Hayden probably did not gain as much recognition, but certainly his winning of the grand prize for poetry at Dakar in the first Festival of Negro Arts in 1966, that was a major achievement. And then, of course, in the 1970s, Hayden gained more honors, unfortunately at an age by which many people have retired. great. He was the first Black American to be consulted in poetry for the Library of Congress, an honor that was repeated. He's a major force then in Afro-American literature. I've told people that I am reluctant to analyze poetic technique. I prefer to read almost semi-consciously, as though I am letting a conjurer perform tricks for me. When I teach Hayden's poetry in class, I try to emphasize for the students, however, 2 or 3 techniques. One is his use of voices, multiple voices in a single poem. Many readers expect to find simply one voice, one persona, whom they sometimes confuse with the poet himself or herself. Hayden, however, not only frequently uses several voices to build the poem, but also requires the readers to distinguish the voices. Some poets who do use a second voice will use quotation marks, not Hayden. Second, I have said to students that they should look particularly for the manner in which Hayden is creating visual images. I was pleased to find my idea supported when Hayden said that he felt that the visual and the auditory were the most important images in his work. He argued that perhaps because his eyesight was poor, he was concerned with the visual images, and because his hearing was excellent, he said possibly to compensate for his eyesight, he became very concerned with the sounds to the extent that he felt he had to hear a line before he could actually compose it the way that he wanted it to be. Now, there are other techniques which could be analyzed. His use of rhythms, for example, at the beginning of Renegade, the rhythm of the words, the short words without punctuation, are intended to suggest the frenzy of the escaping slave. It would be possible to talk about the fact that Hayden seems to avoid the end rhyme or about his metrics. But as I say, I prefer, as I was telling in class the other day, simply to point to it and say, isn't that beautiful? I told people that I thought that a presentation that has been made by Eugene Redmond in a conference on Hayden was an excellent presentation of Hayden's use of blues. What is interesting to me is the fact that Hayden's use of the blues becomes one of the ironies in Hayden's writing poetry. Many people assume that Hayden, a modernist, would be avoiding some of the traditions of Black American culture. In contrast, Hayden does use that tradition, not only in a blues style that he deliberately imitated in some of his earliest poetry, some published in Heart Shape in the Dust, but also in what I call the fusion of the pathetic and the comic in some of his work. Again, there's an irony in the fact that Hayden used Black history and historical figures. Hayden has been identified often merely as a modernist. To people who have not read Hayden's work, this means that he is an individual who has emphasized the creating of poetry that is obscure, poetry that is very scholarly, poetry that ordinary people would not understand. Hayden, late in his life, in 78, I believe, wrote that he still considered the 2 functions of American poetry, the 2 characteristic functions, to be social criticism and discovery. And as part of the discovery, he insisted that American poets wanted to reclaim American history. Now, in the carelessness of a classroom in which no one was checking my statistics, I've said quite often that I think Robert Hayden probably wrote about black heroes and heroines in history more than any other African-American poet in history. His list of black heroes and heroines is impressive, from Sanchez through Phyllis Wheatley, even into George Jackson and Malcolm X of the present. All of this was Hayden's effort to write the book that Benet called for after he had tried to write it in John Brown's Body, a book that would fully explore black history and present it. Hayden tried it first in The Black Spear, a project that he never completed, but certainly he left memorable poems of Frederick Douglass, with Harriet Tubman appearing in another poem, Sojourner Truth in a very strong section of yet another poem. The list is remarkable.
Frederick Douglass. When it is finally ours, this freedom, this liberty, this beautiful and terrible thing, needful to man as air, usable as earth, when it belongs at last to all, when it is truly instinct, brain matter, diastole, systole, reflex action, when it is finally won, when it is more than the gaudy mumbo-jumbo of politicians, this man, this Douglass, this Negro, this former slave, beaten to his knees, exiled, visioning a world where none is lonely, none hunted, none alien. This man, superb in law and logic, this man shall be remembered. Oh, not with statues rhetoric, not with legends and poems and wreaths of bronze alone, but with the life grown out of his life, the lives fleshing his dream of the beautiful, needful thing.
He was interested not only in commemorating heroes and heroines, he was very concerned with the unknown, the anonymous. For example, in the 8 elegies for Paradise Valley that he wrote in one of his later books, he focuses on the individuals who are living the lives that will never make the history books, never make the front pages of the newspapers unless they do something that is criminal. I used to say in writing about County Cullen that County Cullen sympathized with the underprivileged, that these were the magnets who attracted him. Yet Cullen himself came from a class which perhaps was slightly above that. The individual who reared him was a minister. Robert Hayden was coming from the class that might be considered the least privileged in America. His parents, his foster parents, were working individuals. He had been left with the foster parents by his actual parents at a very early age. He experienced the trauma of having the family put on welfare. And of course, during the 30s, he, like many other black writers, worked with the WPA. All of these experiences inspired Hayden, I believe, to an understanding of the people who are the unfortunate. He could see both sides. He could note the manner in which society might be frightened by them, might stand apart from them. But at the same time, he recognized what was most important to him, the human quality that characterized all of them.
This is beautiful.
And Bill, the classy dresser, where is she, who changed her frocks 3 times a day? Where's Nora with her laugh, her comic flair? Stage-struck Nora, waiting for her chance. Where's fast Iowa, who so loved to dance? She left her sick bed one last time to whirl in silver at the palace till she fell. Where's mad Miss Alice, who ate from garbage cans? Where's snuff-dipping Lucy, who played us tunes on her guitar? Where's Henry? Where's Melissa Bell? Let vanished rooms, let dead streets tell. Where's Jim, Watusi Prince, and in France? Where's Tom, the defeated artist? For meals or booze, darting with quarrelsome reds, discontent. Where's gentle brother Davis? Where's Josephine Mel? Let vanished rooms, let dead streets tell. Sundays too, my father got up early and put his clothes on in the blue black cold. Then the cracked hands ached from labor in the weekday weather, made bad fun.
Yeah, it loops back around.
You know they wanted her to hear that one more time. That's right. That's right. Can we just, let's play that poem just one more time.
Those ways, no one ever thanked him. I'd wait and hear the cold splintering, breaking. When the rooms were warm, he'd call, and slowly I would rise and dress, fearing the chronic angers of that house, speaking indifferently to him who had driven out the cold and polished my good shoes as well. What did I know? What did I know of love's austere and lonely opposite?
Yeah!
As one of the foremost creators of Afro-American literature, I have said.
Tell us briefly about the importance of Darwin Turner A and about Dudley Randall and Robert Hayden's distinct style, you know, just their dress, the way they carry themselves.
Darwin Turner was the preeminent scholar of African American literature for decades. And he taught at historically black colleges for years. And then, let me go back a little before. He was a genius. I mean, straight up, he was a genius. He graduated from college when he was 19, finished his PhD when he was like 21 or 22 at Northwestern. But because of when he was born, you know, he could not teach at the same universities that, you know, would give you a PhD. So what happens is that during the student struggles of the 60s, which I obviously say that I was a part of, there was a demand then for black professors in mainstream white universities. And what they did was, of course, go and like raid the campuses of historically black colleges. And Darwin Turner was asked to come and teach at the University of Michigan around the same time that Robert Hayden was brought back to Michigan, where he had been teaching before at Fisk University. He went to Fisk after he finished his master's degree at the University of Michigan, and was there up until late 1960s, maybe 1970, because the student strike at Michigan was in 1970. Yeah, so it would have been after 1970. So actually, one of the reasons that I wanted to involve Darwin, in fact, he was the keynote speaker at the conference we had on Robert Hayden and to commemorate his life on the 10th anniversary of his passing in 1990. Darwin Turner is now deceased, for those of you maybe wondering. But he and Hayden were colleagues at the University of Michigan at the same time. So he knew things, and there's other footage, obviously, about what Hayden was like. I met Darwin Turner actually the first time when I was in grad school at Western Michigan, and he came and spoke on black literature, which was a thrill for me because we never had anybody come to Western Michigan to talk about black literature. And I was heard of my master's at the time. And that's in 1972. 10 years later, Darwin Turner hires me when he is head of African American Studies program at the University of Iowa. And I was his colleague there for about 6 years until I was recruited by Manny Marable to come and teach at Ohio State. So he wrote on every it's amazing, his arsenal of literary criticism. And let's see, what was the other thing you wanted me to comment on, Tony?
Dudley and Robert Hayden's style.
Oh, the style. Oh, okay. Tony was made. I sort of don't notice that so much because I'm from Detroit, but that whole generation, you know, they're just like really understated, very cool, very, you know, like jazz is their main music form, and they sort of exude that coolness. Very measured in their speaking, very particular about how they choose words, even when, not just when they're writing, but also when they're speaking. Hayden, you know, the bow tie, very professorial look. And also Darwin Turner. Darwin Turner was interesting because he was the professor. He always taught and appeared on campus in a suit. Or tweed jacket, we would show him in blue jeans. But he always maintained a almost patrician presence, and was also much more reserved. And when he would, I remember in faculty meetings, and it was him, me, and Peter Nazareth. We were the only color in the room, and there's like about 66 people. And when he would stand up to speak, the room would just go, because everything was like perfect, And that's the way they had to be. There was very little latitude for mistakes. They're the first. They're the ones who are establishing a presence and a standard. And so you would always see them in that particular posture. I wouldn't really call it posture. It really was who they were. It was their style.
I forgot to mention earlier when I introduced you that, Melba actually brought me to Dudley Randall's house, to this crib. And how old was he at the time, 80?
Oh, if he came in, it would have been, was it in 93? Then he would have been 83.
And we're sitting in the living room, and he has like piles of ebony, Jet magazine and stuff like that, along with the books that he published from Broadside Press, on the armchairs and the coffee table and stuff.
Yeah, the house that his wife Vivian was a psychiatric social worker and a world traveler, and she was also a lapidarian. She would collect stones and finish them. I remember when my son graduated from high school, Martin Luther King High School in Detroit in 1997. Other than sort of giving them money, she brought him a stone, because when we go to the house, my children used to love to go and look at the stones and ask her questions, about the stones. But their house, they designed their house and built it. And there are shots of the house in the documentary film. It's a beautiful house, a quad level house. And every room, every wall is just covered with books. I mean, it just was an amazing something of that. I drove by the house the other day because I was talking to Dudley's grandson, and the house is owned by someone, but someone who's now living in Detroit. And so we're trying to figure out what to do about that and see if we can get the house back and sell the house back and do something with it. Maybe even make it like a literary space or something special. And may have to get, we'll see how much grit this new mayor has, get him involved. Tell him that we need to do something to memorialize this house, because it's a beautiful house, and it's in a very old black middle class neighborhood. Tony wanted me to read some Detroit poems. Part of this presentation is the Detroit, literary heritage, and this book has 2 poems in them that are sort of largely about the city, and then in between the individual poems about people. And the first poem, which is kind of hard to read because it has no punctuation until you get to the end, and it's called Why I Observe the Sabbath at Home in the D. Apologies to Emily Dickinson, she has a poem with a similar title. Yeah, the English professor's name on it. The slow kill is a ruthless dirge bestowed on children beveled in star-spangled, irreligious wars over oil or vanishing sweet waters, while political thugs betray language by hiding behind skin tone and trickery of vindictive Republicans and non-literary news announcers, choking on gasoline fumes, gulping the Gulf of Mexico, as drug dealers in disguise sneaking across borderlines, not to pick oranges or tobacco or strawberry fields laden with pesticides of transient cancers or corn genetically grown for lactating breasts of chickens and teenagers, breeding like livestock criminalized at birth to fit the description as byproducts for the prison industry or hypnosis by Xboxes, romance gangster songs, and infractions of demented movie stars who never visit the dark side of Detroit, Newark, Cleveland, or Spanish-speaking Chicago or LA, or any urban reservation where desperation breeds athletes for battlefields as 2D distractions if they can duck the bullets shot below the hoop across playground perimeters, a hit meant for Antoine, DeAndre's cousin who spells his name with a Y, to make him feel special when his mama calls his name before an incidental insult of vocabulary incites someone's paranoid, frenetic, delusional child, toting an automatic to celebrate himself on TV's First 48, while his parents disappear inside supersized churches, hoisting misery like pagan sacrifices for gilded prophets, sporting blue alligator shoes and gold-toothed grins that glitter when abusing the Bible, misquoting Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and the Apostle Paul, dancing preachers dredging up testaments, condemning material enslavement, and promising life after Jesus' death, paid for in platinum offering plates, sucking juice out the side of bent necks of faithful flocks, to put premium gas in luxury convertibles with chrome hubcaps spinning in reverse in sync with Wall Street investors, confiscating cityscapes by burning houses on Halloween Eve, disabling maple trees, ravaging evergreens, damming rivers, offending any semblance of justice until memories curdle in shadows of premature death, and black streaks of light appear on tombstones like hieroglyphic tattoos encrypting mortal damnation. I think Jim Jordan calls that a long poem. We want our city back. This poem, I have to say, it just keeps growing. I started it or wrote it like 20 years ago, I think, right after things began to change. And then the different stanzas have grown to different phases of insanity. We want our city back. We want our streetlights on. We want our garbage gone. We want our children playing on playgrounds, but not with loaded guns. We want to retire by the river and raise collard greens in abandoned fields. We want our ancestors to rest in peace. We want our city back. We don't want law and order. We want justice and jobs. We don't want small business, mean, serious business. No more mom and pop wig shops. No more Mickey D's rapping with the homies. No more dollar stores. We need groceries. No more Dixie Colonels serving Kente cloth cuisine. No more Taco Supreme. No more indigestion or quick fix politics. We want our city back. We don't want police harassing the homeless for being without a lease. We don't want video cops busting crackheads with flashlights at night. We want peacekeepers to capture the real dope men, reclining in respectable privilege. We want our taxes to track down the real assassins. We want our city back. We don't want Eurocentric or Afro-eccentric educations. We want a freedom curriculum. We want a liberated vision and history remembered. We don't want our children crunched like computer chips to fit in the old world order, worshiping slave-holding societies in Egypt or Greece. We want the Board of Education to take a lie detector test for neglect of the intellect, for assault on our children's senses. We don't want them to be GM execs or rejects in labor camps. We want dignity, not cupidity. We want our city back. No more tech sex mess, no more zoot suit mayors shuffling skeletons and abuses like gamblers losing paychecks. No more ex-basketball suburban Bingaling mayors ignoring inner city citizens living next to boarded up doors and bolted windows. No more broken trees. No more Motor City casinos or dilapidated buildings where junkies, rodents, and vermin spring. We want our city back. We want the river dredged for distraught souls. We want our homes rebuilt. We want the guilty to pay a greed tax for the living they stole. We want our city back. Hey, we ain't going away like fugitive slaves escaping to Canada. Our backs are up against the wall. This is our clarion call. Feed the hungry, clothe the ragged, heal the sick, enlighten the ignorant, punish the wicked, and raise the dead. We want our streetlights on. We want our garbage gone. We want to be rid of smack and crack. We want to retire by the river. We want our ancestors to rest in peace. We are claiming our history, seizing our hour, because we mean to take our city back.
Yeah!